Good morning, everyone. We're so glad you could join us. We're just waiting for everyone else to log in real quick. We've got quite a few people who've signed up for today's presentation, so we're really excited about that. So just give us a moment. But while you're waiting, why don't you put in the chat where you're dialing in from? We'd love to hear where everybody is from. Hi, Mark. Jane.
Elkton, all right.
Hi, everyone. In case you just dialed in, we were just saying while we're waiting for everyone else to log in, if you want to go ahead and put in the chat where you're signing on from, we'd love to see that. Thank you. Ohio, welcome. Connecticut.
Toronto. Wow.
Newtown.
Texas.
Toronto.
Texas.
Pennsylvania, Connecticut. Coastal Bend, Texas. Is that Longmont County or Colorado?
Colorado. Minnesota.
That's far away. Machapongo. State Park. Yep, to 100.
Hello, everyone. Once again, we wanted to say hello and welcome to our webinar today. We're so glad to have you here. We have people typing into the chat where they're from, so we can see we're all interested to see where you're from. It's great to see people from Virginia and from all over the United States. So we're excited. If you have any issues hearing me, this lovely cat, which is our program director, Beth's cat, is going to tell you how to help with the audio issues. So go ahead and read the slide and hopefully that can help.
Be 212.
Idaho.
Yeah.
Welcome, Brittany from Idaho.
Hi, Tim. Good to see you.
Tim, I think you're muted. You just said
I
a bunch of
was.
stuff.
I was just asking. I was asking Rowena how her olive is doing.
It's doing well in its pot. I wanted to get some more information from you about where I should plant it before I do anything with it. Tim very nicely got me. Oh, you meant olive. I thought you were asking about my spice bush. My olive is waiting for Tim to come in and take care of it. My autumn olive. Ontario.
worried.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Rowena, I think we could go ahead and get started, and I'm sure we'll have more people signing on.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm Rowena Zimmerman, and I am the Communications and Outreach Coordinator for Blue Ridge PRISM. All of us at Blue Ridge PRISM are so excited to have you here with us today. We had over 700 people sign up, and we're really excited about that. Today, I'm also joined by William Hammerski, Rod Walker, Jim Harley, and Tim Maywald, who are our invaluable PRISM volunteers who will help manage your great questions. So they'll be the ones answering your questions in the Q&A. And that's where we'd like you to direct your questions, not the chat, but the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Blue Ridge PRISM is so pleased to host Celia Vuocolo and Beth Mizell, who is our program director, who'll be giving the presentation Invasive Plants, Pollinators, and Herbicides. Thanks to each of them for being here with us today, and for all of you for joining us as our audience. A few things before we get started. Here are some Zoom tips that Beth, do you want to take over and just say a few of the highlights from that to help make things easier for all of you?
Sure. So we have a few housekeeping things. So we have a lot of people that are participating in today's webinar. And I just want to remind you to please direct your questions to the Q&A box. And if you go to the bottom of your screen and hover, you should see the Q&A, and that'll pop up, and that's where you can ask your questions. We'll be turning off the chat during the presentation, but we will be dropping relevant links and information into the chat box for you to grab and review later. And then lastly, we've turned off the raise your hand function for this event. There's just too many people to manage live questions like that. So yeah, remember to direct your questions to the Q&A. Thanks, Rowena.
Thank you, Beth. So hopefully that'll help. And moving on, we just want to share a few of PRISM's upcoming events for you. We're really excited that our summer invasive plant workshops are now open for registration. And so if you want to take a look, we have several choices for you, online or in person. So you can decide what works best for you. Our online workshops are going to take place on May 10th and May 12th. May 10th will be at the identification of invasive plants, and May 12th will be the management and control of invasive plants. Each of those webinars are $10, and you can register. You'll see the link down on the bottom. And then we have two in-person field days available for you as well. In the northern part of the PRISM region, we have Loudoun County's field day, which is in collaboration with Oak Spring Garden Foundation. And there's a morning and afternoon session on May 14th. Once again, take a look and see if that'll work for you. And that'll be a really fun day because it's a beautiful location, and it will be with both PRISM staff and Oak Spring staff who'll help you during that day. And then PRISM's own summer invasive plant workshop in person will be at Penn Park in Charlottesville, more in the southern part of our region on May 22nd, and that's $25. So please go to our website, www.blueridgeprism.org, for more information. And finally, we're going to try to answer every question that we get, but because we've got over 700 people signed up, we're not going to be able to do that to get to every single one. So if you have any additional questions and you feel like we weren't able to answer them, please email us at info@blueridgeprism.org. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to turn off the chat now. Well, actually, I'll turn it off in just a second. But first, I want to remind you that we're recording this meeting, and it's going to be available on PRISM's YouTube channel in the next few days. So we'll be sending everybody who registered an email with a link to the recording. So if you have to leave early, or you know someone who signed up and who wasn't able to attend, just know that you will have an access to this recording. Okay, I'd like to go ahead and start our meeting with introducing the founder and current president of our board and of Blue Ridge PRISM, Rod Walker, who's going to give us an update on recent PRISM activities. Rod?
Okay, let me share my screen here. Get this going. Hello. There we go.
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Rowena. Welcome everybody. Delighted to have you here on this on this beautiful spring day, at least for where we are. I'm going to give a few quick program updates, talk about some great new news for the PRISM, a few words about fundraising, and there's any questions, we can deal with those. But this will be relatively quick, so that we get on to the main part of the presentation. So in terms of landowner activities, this year, we're going to have our 4 quarterly meetings. This is one of them. We had one in January. Tabling events. In the last several times we've done these types of discussions, we've said, hey, we're not doing any tabling events because of the pandemic. On the other hand, we're seeing that starting to open up, and so we'll start be doing more tabling events. So there's some place you'd like us to come join one of your events, that's certainly discussable. Likewise, speaking engagements, we'll probably do something like 20 of them this year. If you have a group that you'd like to have a speaking, have one of us come speak about invasive plants in the program, so we'd be happy to do that. We do this frequently. We've got our spring, summer, and fall workshops. The spring workshops are done. Rowena just gave you an update and with heads up on the summer workshops coming up here in May and June. We send out our quarterly newsletters. There's lots of materials available around our programs and the invasive plants on our website. In terms of some numbers, last year we had over 2,000 attendees at our events, almost double the year before. And at this point, we're well over 3,000 people on our email list, and by the time the year's over, hopefully we'll be pushing 4,000. So it's things are moving. Some of you are aware we've had landowner financing in the history of the PRISM. We've generated over $1 million of financing that has gone directly to the landowners who need to do invasive plant removal. Most of those programs are going to be wrapping up this year, so we're going to be looking at more opportunities that are and proposals that we can turn in to try and generate some additional funding. So we've got our NRCS program that has helped 94 landowners do work for 3 years on over 2,000 acres. We've had our DuPont settlement grant that's helped with treating wavy leaf grass at 6 sites. And our U.S. Forest Service grant that came through the Department of Forestry. Thank you, Lori, for additional funding to help with our wavy leaf treatment. And so stay tuned. We'll see if we can come up with some more here in the course of the year. Some other key activities that we're involved in is we've got a study that we're involved in that we helped to get started with VDOT, Department of Transportation, where they've hired Virginia Tech to analyze hundreds of sites around the state and look at what kinds of plants are growing there, both native and non-native, with a view to making recommendations to VDOT on what should be on their planting list. Which is currently dominated by non-native plants. So hopefully by the time this process is over, there'll be a lot more native plants being put on the VDOT planting list when they do construction projects or maintenance activities. We're also continue to be involved in putting more plants on the Virginia noxious weeds list. Right at the moment, there are 12 plants kind of wending their way through the process to get to final approval. They made it through the Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services board last December. In another year or two, they'll finish the rest of the process to get them published and with public comment to actually get it on the official list of noxious weeds. You can see the 12 plants listed here. There's a lot of really important plants here that need to be added to the list. And anybody wants to get involved in nominating more, we're happy to entertain volunteers to help us put in more nominations. But we have a drone project that we work with the University of Virginia on. This is to prove that we can have a drone fly over a large piece of property with some very special equipment that will capture 240 wavelengths of light from each pixel, which is about that big. Analyze that to look for the spectral signature of specific plants like autumn olive and ailanthus, and see if we can produce maps of where the specific plants are located. So very plant specific maps so that will help with a variety of different things, including treatment programs. We're also involved in trying to get action and information out to landowners before the spotted lanternfly arrives on their property. In particular, there's some studies that show that if you remove Ailanthus before the spotted lanternfly arrives, you will probably have a much less intense infestation. So it's important to get that word out. Likewise, we stand ready as always to, if there's other people out there who would like to form another PRISM, particularly in Virginia, but not necessarily just in Virginia. We're happy to help people, with that process, share materials, experience, etc., about how to do that. Now, so there's some really important stuff that's come up more recently, which is late last year. We were approached by a private funding source that wanted to help with the battle, if you will, against invasive plants. And this has led to several different things. First of all, we've added 2 more counties to our original 10-county targeted geography. So Loudoun and Fauquier counties in Virginia are now added to our coverage area. And in May, in the next few weeks, we will be adding 2 new full-time employees to the PRISM, and these will be invasive management specialists. And a large part of their job will be to work with our partners, create more partners, create more programs, and also specifically be available to work with landowners, walk the property with landowners, and help them understand what they have growing there and what are their options and resources to deal with it. So stay tuned. This will not all be available immediately, but there will be information being published here in the next month about these resources, the services they'll be providing, and perhaps when some of those services will be available. So stay tuned. This is a big deal. This is great. We're really excited about this. It's really going to provide a whole nother level of service to all of you out there. In addition to that, we got a second major grant that's going to allow the PRISM to actually acquire an unusual piece of equipment or pieces of equipment, which includes a high volume sprayer. So if you can picture something that's got a 150-gallon tank and 2 600-foot hoses, picture that, a 600-foot hose, that's the length of 2 football fields. So we got 2 of those on this thing, as well as the transport equipment that will allow this spraying equipment to be moved up into some really challenging terrains. So we have some of that to be dealt with, and including the next item here, which is this funding includes the costs to deal with a large, multi-hundred acre wavy leaf infestation south of Charlottesville, which is going to need this equipment, but this equipment is going to be available for other uses as well. So where we've got tricky situations or large scale situations, we'll now have access to some really important equipment to do that. In addition, we've got some funding that will allow us to hire a consultant to get some advice on how best to get the legislation passed in Richmond to deal with things like, how do we get invasive plants, out of the nursery trade, because there's lots of them still being sold across the state. We also have in mind to convene a statewide conference of not just the PRISM, but our partners and other interested parties to come up with statewide strategies to address key invasive plant issues. So stay tuned for that. We'll be working on that later this year with the intention of having the conference convene sometime, hopefully early next year. So stay tuned. Lots of fun things coming up, big changes and big steps up. And from a fundraising standpoint, our core operations continue to be funded 100% by grants and donations. And actually the real core of our operation comes from 2 $20,000 matching grants, one from the Virginia Environmental Endowment and one from a family foundation. Each of these requires us to raise an equal amount, another $20,000 of donations from people like all of you on here. So last November, we applied for our next Virginia Environmental Endowment grant. We should be hearing that answer literally any day now. Should that come through, you'll probably see a campaign coming across to raise the additional $20,000 we will need to match that. So yeah, last year, late last year, we did the Family Foundation match. Thank you for all of you who helped us do that. And donations can actually be made anytime, through our website. So yeah, things are looking good there. Just a couple of reminders. Rowena covered the workshops and other events coming up. Again, you can do donations, or if you have questions afterwards, you can contact us through the website. If you want a speaker for your group, you can contact us through the website as well. Likewise, I just wanted to highlight one item, which is if any of you have large groves of Ailanthus, there is a researcher at Virginia Tech looking for landowner volunteers to participate in a study on using the verticillium wilt fungus to kill Ailanthus. So if you have a large amount of Ailanthus and want to participate in a study, you can see either our recent newsletter for details on that program, or you can just contact us again directly through the website, and we will put you in touch with the researchers down at Virginia Tech. So those are the updates here. So if there's any questions, I'll be happy to entertain them. Otherwise, we'll move on to the main event. Rowena or anybody, are there any questions out there?
Thank you, Rod. I don't see any questions right now. One thing I did forget to say is that you're going to be asked at the end of this meeting to fill out a really short survey, and we'd really appreciate it if you just took just 5 minutes of your time to do that. I'll try to remind you again at the end of this meeting, but just in case, there's just a short exit survey, just so we know how we can improve and serving you and in doing our program. So I appreciate that if you do that. So first, I'd like to just go ahead and introduce our two speakers for today, our main event, which is the presentation called Invasive Plants, Pollinators, and Herbicides. First, in the introduction is Celia Vuocolo. Celia has over 10 years of experience in wildlife conservation and is the private lands biologist for Northeast Virginia. She provides technical assistance and information on USDA cost share programs for landowners interested in managing land for early successional species like the northern bobwhite, native pollinators, and grassland birds. Celia's position is supported by a partnership between Quail Forever, Natural Resources Conservation Service, and Department of Wildlife Resources. She's passionate about pollinator conservation, particularly bumblebees, and has spent time surveying and studying the effects of a gut parasite, Nosema, on local bumblebee populations. She's currently working towards a master's in natural resources and restoration ecology and habitat management through the University of Idaho. Our next presenter is Beth Mizell, our program director. Prior to joining Blue Ridge PRISM, Beth Meisel was a land steward with the Nature Conservancy for 14 years, caring for natural areas and restoring rare natural communities. She's a level 1 Chesapeake Bay landscape professional and holds a license as a Virginia commercial pesticide applicator. So we are so pleased to have Celia and Beth here today, and they have a fascinating presentation. So I invite everyone just to sit back and enjoy. And once again, if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. Thank you. Beth and Celia.
Oh, thank you, Rowena. I just want to check to make sure that you can see the presentation.
Looks good.
Okay. Well, thank you, Rowena, for that wonderful introduction. And this all started because last summer I really noticed bumblebees and other insects that were feasting on the flowers of the invasive vine porcelainberry. There's a lot of porcelainberry around Charlottesville. And that observation combined with the many questions we get here at PRISM about the impacts of herbicides to wildlife and insects really sparked the idea for this presentation. The topic intrigued Celia, who also fields a lot of these sorts of questions, and I'm pleased to have had the opportunity to collaborate with her on this important topic. I'm hearing some background noise. Can all of the panelists make sure to mute themselves. Thank you. Okay, so we have our session broken up into a few parts today, and Celia and I will be working off the same presentation. So Celia is going to get us started with pollination biology overview and cover the effects of invasive plants on pollinators. I will take over with a terminology review and explore herbicide impacts on pollinators and what we know, and then walk through some mitigation strategies. And then Celia will close with a pollinator protection case study, which I love this part of this presentation, and a review, and then we'll take your questions. So we're going to have a lot of questions today, and we love all your questions, but I just want to say we probably won't get to answer all of them today, and I have a strong suspicion we're actually going to go over past 1 o'clock. So we'll try to hang on for a few minutes past 1 o'clock, but if you have to hop off right at 1, remember this is being recorded and you can catch up with what you miss later. So let's go ahead and get started, and I will turn this over to Celia to please introduce our North American pollinators.
Great. Thank you so much, Beth, for inviting me to participate in this program. And hi, folks. So I'm going to provide you all with a very brief overview of pollinator life histories and biology. So understanding how these insects function and interact with plants will give you a better understanding of how to mitigate your herbicide use. The more you know, the better off the bees will be. So in North America, our pollinators are primarily insects, with the exception of hummingbirds and some bats in the Southwest. I've highlighted bees and butterflies and moths here because these are the species groups that we will be focusing on today. Also, next to no research has been done, unfortunately, on the effects of herbicides on most insects, and more on that in a bit. So pollinators are suffering the impacts of several conservation threats, and I'm sure a lot of you are aware of this, but I've listed out the 4 main ones here on the slide. Pathogens include a pretty large group of viruses, bacterial disease, parasites, and fungal infections that plague a pretty wide range of pollinating insects. Most people are familiar with colony collapse disorder in honeybees, which is essentially a complex web of pathogens and other stressors, but there are many different kinds of pathogens that are causing issues. For example, the gut parasite Nosema is one of the main drivers in the decline of the federally endangered rusty patch bumblebee. And aside from pathogens and pesticides, if they don't outright kill bees, will suppress their immune systems, making them more susceptible to illness. Climate change also provides challenges for insect pollinators, and like other animals, bees have thresholds when it comes to temperature tolerance. And what we're seeing are ranges shift as our world warms. So bumblebees in particular are moving northward and higher up in elevation to essentially escape the heat. Additionally, warming temperatures mean that flowers may bloom earlier or bees may emerge earlier, which can create phenology gaps. And of course, the effects of habitat loss are huge, and this is where invasive species fit in. Invasive species are one of the leading causes of habitat loss and degradation. Here's a quick snapshot of native bees by the numbers, just to give you some perspective. We have over 4,000 species of native bees in North America and 20,000 plus worldwide. There are more than 460 species of bees that have been recorded in Virginia alone, which includes some invasive species. We have 9 species listed under the Endangered Species Act. This includes the rusty patch bumblebee, which I mentioned earlier, but that is also happens to be found in Virginia as well. 7 species are native only to Hawaii, and a second bumblebee is found only in the Pacific Northwest. Native bees are incredibly diverse in body size, shape, and color, and we have metallic green sweat bees, we've got robust yellow and black patterned bumblebees, my personal favorite, and pretty much everything in between. Native bees are just as variable in the timing of their life cycles as they are in physical appearance. So not surprisingly, bees aren't active during the warmer months of the year, which is during the growing season. and depending on the species, may only be active for a few weeks to a few months before they go into dormancy to essentially wait out the winter. I have two bee genera up here on the slide that I think demonstrate this point fairly well. So the mining bees, which are in the chart on the left, are mainly active in our area of Virginia from March to May, and then enter dormancy. In contrast, one of the sweat bee genus, Agapostemon, which is on the right here, is active from late May all the way through to November. Both species lay eggs in the ground, but have very different floral preferences due to the timing of year that they're out and about, essentially. So North American native bees can pretty much be split into two teams when it comes to nesting preferences. So 70% of them lay eggs in the ground, and 30% lay their eggs in tube-like structures like dead standing flower stems or dead wood, for example. A lot of our collective knowledge in terms of bee nests is based on honeybees, which are nowhere near similar to the vast majority of bees on the planet. Native bees don't usually create colonial hives, so they don't protect their nests like honeybees or some colonial wasps like your yellow jackets. A queen bee simply lays an egg, provisions it with a pollen ball, seals off the chamber, and kind of continues that way until she's finished and then moves on. The bees will eventually hatch out on their own and fly away. It's important to note that because most native bees nest in the ground, they can be very susceptible to ground disturbance like pulling or disking, as well as ground applied chemicals, which Beth is going to touch more on later. Lastly, and this is the part that has the most relevance to our topic today, bees exhibit various floral preferences when collecting pollen and consuming nectar. I actually have an entire presentation that's just on pollination biology, but in a nutshell, there have been evolutionarily based relationships that have developed over millions of years between flowers and bees. Flower shape, color, access to pollen, nectar, bloom time, all of those things have evolved alongside pollinators, and flowering traits are based on the plant's reproductive strategy and which pollinator they essentially want to attract to get the job done. Some bees, like bumblebees, are generalists but have preferred plants. Others are more specialized, like the squash bees here on the screen, which only harvest cucurbit pollen. Even more highly specialized is species like the Andrena originae in the bottom left corner, which collects pollen only from spring beauty and Carolina spring beauty and no other flowers. Some of these relationships are so specialized that without the right plant in the landscape, that bee won't be there either. And of course, let's not forget the importance of native bees to agriculture. And on the right side of my slide, you'll see a mining bee foraging on a blueberry flower. And I actually took this photo about 2 days ago in my backyard. Native bees are a very important part of crop pollination, and in a lot of cases are more efficient pollinators of fruit and vegetables than honeybees. So switching gears a bit to butterflies and moths, which are in the family Lepidoptera. It shouldn't come as too much of a surprise that we have an amazing diversity of Lepidopterans, over 141,000 species worldwide. Most Lepidopterans are considered incidental pollinators, meaning that they don't intentionally collect pollen like bees do. So instead, they're after the nectar and may accidentally get pollen on their wings while foraging and then transfer it to other flowers. There are some exceptions, however, such as the great spangled fritillary butterfly, which you see here on the screen. And that's a specialized pollinator of the flame azalea. You can see in the photo here that the anthers, which are the long tube-like structures of the flame azalea, are really far apart from each other. So pollination with small insects is usually not very successful. However, because of the broad wingspan of this butterfly, pollination between the anthers can occur as it flaps its wings. And of course, caterpillars are a crucial source of food for almost every animal species on the planet, and are therefore a very important link in the food web. Additionally, our native Lepidoptera and caterpillars rely on native plants as larval hosts. And anyone who's familiar with Dr. Doug Tallamy's work knows that invasive plant species very rarely, if at all, serve as host plants for native caterpillars. which leads me to this point. Invasive plants affect pollinators in different ways. The lepidopterans and specialist bees, which were the bees I mentioned earlier that only collect pollen from certain plants, are the most impacted when invasive plants outcompete their native host plants. These groups of pollinator species can suffer tremendous population declines if the plants that support them disappear from the landscape. However, not all pollinators are necessarily negatively impacted by invasive plants. So generalist bee species who can visit a wide range of flowers can still make a living if, and this is a big if, the invasive plants that invade their landscape also produce flowers with nectar and pollen. For example, when I was doing my graduate research on bumblebee queens, one of the most popular bumblebee flowers that I found them foraging on was autumn olive. Honeybees are also quite at home to forage on European invasives like English ivy, for example, which makes sense since they are not native to North America and can more readily use these species. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't treat your autumn olive shrubs because bumblebees use them. There's a lot we don't know about pollinator and invasive plant interactions, and that's the point I really want to drive home. We don't know whether or not the nutritional value of the pollen is sufficient for that bee at that moment in their life cycle. What we do know is that eating the same one or two things for most of your life is not going to be good for any animal, and that pollinators need to have a diversity of nutritional options. This is very important. This is because each plant species pollen varies in nutritional and protein content. Invasive species can cause monocultures that decrease plant diversity. I think we all know this, but this could theoretically lead to nutritional deficits in bees. So I thought I would just throw this slide in here since we're talking invasives. We have several invasive bee species in Virginia, and this one, which is the giant resin bee, is the one that I run into the most often. It is huge, so it's about the size of a carpenter bee and originates from China. And because of that, guess what it likes to forage on? Kudzu. It's not the only plant it forages on, but it's definitely on its menu. And when kudzu blooms, it's another plant that's similar to autumn olive. It can attract some native bees and butterflies as well. But the takeaway here is that invasive plants can support invasive insects, which can outcompete native bees for food and nesting sites. Keep an eye out for these guys and a few other invasive leafcutter species that can show up in those native bee houses that everyone loves, especially in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. There's a recent study that came out from the University of Virginia and University of Delaware that showed that there are 2 other Osmia species, which are in the mason bee family, that have been identified as a potential driver of the decline of 6 other native mason bee species. So now that we've reviewed some basic bee and butterfly natural history, let's talk a bit about how their biology can put them at risk for chemical exposure. Let's start with pollinator to chemical contact. So since pollinators are small and mobile, and even if you're not intending to spray them with herbicide during application, they can accidentally be saturated with chemicals if they are flying near or sitting on a flowering plant. Additionally, their nesting materials, such as flower stems or dead wood, as I mentioned earlier, as well as their ground nesting sites, can become contaminated by herbicides if they are directly sprayed. Systemic contact relates more to systemic pesticides or insecticides, which are taken up by the plant and can persist in all parts, depending on the chemical, including the roots, the seeds, flowers, leaves, and stem. Neonicotinoids, which are a class of pesticide that's garnered a lot of attention in the press, operates this way. Herbicides are a type of pesticide, but not all pesticides are herbicides. It's sort of like saying that a thumb is a finger, but not all fingers are thumbs. So I'm going to now turn things over to Beth, who's going to talk a little bit more about the differences in terminology when it comes to herbicides and pesticides.
Thank you, Celia. All right, so what is a pesticide? A pesticide is an umbrella term for a substance or mixture of substances intended for preventing, destroying, repelling, or mitigating any pest or substance intended for use as a plant regulator, defoliant, or desiccant. So basically, pesticides include insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides, and many others. So many headlines and studies often refer to pesticides as being harmful to bees and butterflies. However, oftentimes insecticides are the real culprits causing harm. Insecticides kill insects. Oh, let me go to my next slide. Insecticides kill insects and other arthropods targeting their nervous system or stages of development. During today's presentation, we will be specifically discussing herbicides. So what is an herbicide? Herbicides kill weeds and other plants that grow where they're not wanted. Herbicides can regulate growth, inhibit a plant's function like photosynthesis, or inhibit a plant's cell division. Now, bear with me because there's a lot happening in this slide and I have a lot to say about it. But it's really important to understand how herbicides are tested for pollinator safety. And it's also important to understand how there's some shortcomings in this testing, which I'll get to just here in a second. So first, just because an herbicide product is approved by the Environmental Protection Agency does not mean it's safe for all pollinators. You may be surprised to learn the standardized testing used to evaluate herbicides does not include most insects. The testing looks at the impacts of a particular chemical on the non-native European honeybee, which is, by the way, the only terrestrial insect evaluated in this testing. The measure of toxicity is called LD50. LD50 is the lethal dose for a pesticide, which results in 50% mortality to the honeybees in the testing population. LD50 is measured in micrograms, and for the honeybee, a rating of highly toxic to bees is less than or equal to 2 micrograms per honeybee. The toxic to bees rating is less than 11 micrograms and greater than 2 micrograms. So basically, the lower the LD50, the more toxic a pesticide is to bees and other creatures. The higher the LD50, the less toxic it is to honeybees. So pesticides that are considered highly toxic to bees and highly toxic are required to have special instructions on the product label. So this testing is helpful, but as Celia mentioned, honeybees are very different than our native bees. So the honeybee is not the best surrogate for testing the impacts of herbicides and all pesticides on our native bees. Honeybees are dramatically different than North American native bees and have very different life histories, as Celia mentioned. Honeybees are social. The colony is perennial, feeding on honey through the winter. Our native bees have short lifespans, living just a few weeks or months during the growing season. Most of them are solitary, and honeybees and native bees can be active at different times of the day and at different temperatures. The standardized testing also does not take into account the real-world scenarios that native pollinators may encounter. They will encounter exposure to multiple pesticides throughout their day. So herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides, all of these at once, whose effects may be compounding. So tests are conducted on honeybees with one ingredient at a time rather than using multiple chemicals. The inactive ingredients and adjuvants in herbicide formulations are also not evaluated, so those impacts remain unknown. Sensitivity to herbicides can be based on insect physiology and body size. Again, native bees are vastly different from the European honeybees and from one another. So I want to encourage you to learn more from the Xerces Society. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And they offer a great series of presentations that do a much deeper dive into the toxicology and standardized testing of all pesticides. This presentation from April 2020 called Pesticides and Pollinators, Understanding the Risk, is the primary reference for this slide, and it is available on the Xerces YouTube channel. So I encourage you to check it out. There's also a follow-up video on how to mitigate for pesticides and protect pollinators. Really good information, and it was extremely helpful to me in understanding this topic more. So because of the inadequate testing of herbicides, their inactive ingredients, their adjuvants on native pollinators, there's a lot that we do not know. We can infer from the testing that does happen on honeybees and from other areas of research to start to understand how herbicides might impact pollinators. So as herbicide applicators and land stewards, protecting pollinators along with other insects and wildlife and ourselves when using herbicides begins with us. So using herbicides thoughtfully and minimally is the overarching theme of our discussion today. So be responsible, be conservative, and be knowledgeable about using herbicides. More specific strategies to protect pollinators when controlling invasive plants will be reviewed later in this presentation. But I'd like to, the next few slides, we're going to look at what we do know about herbicides and native pollinators. So first, consider that not all herbicides are created equal. Even if an herbicide has the same active ingredient, there are differences between brands and formulations. And if you've gone to buy an herbicide, you have seen how many options you have, and it can be overwhelming. So for example, the active ingredient glyphosate comes under various brand names like Roundup, Rodeo, Razor Pro, and generic brands you may get at your local farm store. All of these formulations have the same active ingredient, glyphosate, but they differ in where they can be applied, the types of inactive ingredients that are in the formulation, and the concentration of the active ingredient. All of the examples in this slide are various glyphosate products, and that's just scratching the surface. So reading and understanding the herbicide label will help you to understand exactly what the herbicide is, along with where and how to use it. And I wanted to highlight a recent study that came out that you may have seen. It was published in 2021, and the researchers looked more closely at the product Roundup and its mortality effects on the bumblebee species Bombus terrestris odax. I think I pronounced that correctly. Several Roundup products were compared, which included a ready-to-use spray, so that little bottle that you buy at the store, the squirt on the plant that you don't want, and a Roundup Pro active concentrate, so the bigger jug that you mix with water to the correct concentration. And they looked at those alongside a non-Roundup brand glyphosate called Weedol, which is, I figured out, is only sold in the United Kingdom. Bees were sprayed at label rates, and high mortality was observed in the Roundup products. The researchers observed the Roundup products caused the matting of the bees' hair, which interfered with their breathing. The Weedol product did not cause significant mortality. So these results point to the surfactants or other inactive ingredients specifically in the Roundup causing the mortality rather than the active ingredient glyphosate. So this study showed the direct application of the product Roundup causing mortality of bees. Keep in mind, this was one study, and the mortality to bees was from the surfactant rather than the glyphosate. Again, because inactive ingredients in herbicides remain untested, it is difficult to know what might be detrimental. We will explore strategies on how to best protect pollinators from the potential impacts of herbicide, either when using Roundup or any other herbicides. Pardon me. So oils, such as horticultural oils and plant-derived oils, are often used as insecticides. These oils are sprayed on the target insect, thus blocking the insect's spiracles. Spiracles are the holes in their body by which they breathe. The insecticide interferes with the insect's respiration and the insect is killed. Caterpillars breathe in this way too. Similar oils are used as adjuvants for herbicide application. Adjuvants may be plant-based non-ionic surfactants, horticultural oils, or petrol and plant-derived basal oils. Again, because of the inadequate testing of herbicides, their inactive ingredients, and adjuvants on native pollinators, there is a lot we do not know. We should assume that oil-based herbicides, surfactants, and oil-based adjuvants could potentially cause direct mortality, similar to the insecticidal oils, and should be conservative using caution when applying these types of herbicides and adjuvants. So grass-specific herbicides using a crop oil as an adjuvant may be less concerning because grasses are mostly wind pollinated rather than insect pollinated. The chances of encountering foraging bees in a solid patch of flowering Japanese stilt grass, for example, will be significantly lower than a flowering autumn olive. It should be noted, however, in some instances, bees can be opportunistic and forage on flowering grasses, and there could be a nesting site nearby. It should be noted that one grass-specific herbicide, sethoxydim, was problematic for both bees and butterflies, having moderately acute contact toxicity, direct mortality, in honeybees, and causing developmental problems in butterfly larvae. Sethoxydim is the active ingredient in Post, high yield grass killer, and others. So best management practices is very important when you're using these types of products. So we got a lot of questions about herbicide alternatives and what about organic herbicides? Oh, okay. I'm trying to manage two screens at once here, sorry. So what about those organic herbicides? You think natural, organic, but don't be fooled and assume that they are safe for bees and other pollinators when controlling invasive plants. The example here is a herbicide product with clove oil, and as it's one of its active ingredients, and it smells fantastic. So just because it's naturally derived, or you might be able to put it in your salad, or that it smells good, does not mean it is effective for invasive plant management or good for pollinators. Alternative herbicides are typically contact herbicides and not systemic herbicides, meaning they work by killing back the plant's foliage and not the roots. Because these herbicides are not systemic, the invasive plant will grow back and not be fully controlled. Repeated herbicide applications will be required, and more, not less, herbicide will be used in the longer run. There's another kind of organic herbicide called fatty acid herbicides or herbicidal soaps that are often approved for organic gardening. The active ingredients of herbicidal soaps are pelargonic acid, caprylic acid, and capric acid, ammonium nonate, and ammoniated soap of fatty acids. So product examples are weedicide herbicide soap, Scythe, Burnout Formula 2, and BioSafe weed and grass killer. The label of BioSafe weed and grass killer specifically states, quote, "The product is toxic to bees exposed to direct treatment or residues on blooming crops or weeds. Do not apply this product if bees are visiting the treatment area," end quote. So you might be tempted to mix your own natural herbicides at home, and these can be equally problematic. Combinations of salt, vinegar, and soaps and other do-it-yourself herbicide recipes could have unknown impacts to the soil and to the pollinators. They may seem safe, but salt, vinegar, soaps, they're chemicals too. And keep in mind that researchers use soap in bee kill traps to collect specimens for study. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some indirect impacts of herbicide. And the first is the residues of herbicides. Native pollinators can be indirectly impacted by herbicides after they applied through exposure in their nesting material and their nesting category, their nesting cavities. As Celia mentioned, 70% of native bees nest in the ground, and the remaining 30% are cavity nesting using dead wood and hollow stems. So once an herbicide is applied to a plant, what happens to it? Herbicides and pesticides have an environmental fate, and that environmental fate varies depending on the active ingredient. The herbicide can be absorbed by the tissues of the target plant. It can be adsorbed, binding to the soil particles. It can move in the environment through erosion or water runoff. It can leach into the groundwater, or it can degrade from exposure to sunlight, water, microbes, and volatilization, or it could do all of those things. And the half-life of an herbicide is the amount of time it takes for half of the herbicide to break down in the environment. A single half-life can be measured in hours or days. So sometimes this information can be found in the product label or safety data sheet. Pesticide half-lives can be lumped into 3 groups in order to estimate the product's persistence. These groups are low, which is less than a 16-day half-life, moderate, which is 16 to 59-day half-life, and high, which is over 60 days. Pesticides with a shorter half-life are less likely to persist in the environment. The longer an herbicide persists in the environment before it breaks down, the risk increases for a pollinator to be exposed to its residue. Delayed mortality is not accounted for during the standard herbicide testing period for honeybees. Again, there's a lot that we do not know. Another indirect impact of herbicides can be loss of habitat. The loss of habitat and removal of nectar resources and host plants is a negative indirect impact, resulting typically from the improper use of herbicides. So first, drift from herbicide applications will cause non-target damage to native plants that are adjacent to the control site. Herbicides that tend to volatilize, like triclopyr ester 2,4-D, can easily move from an application site. So care must be taken to follow the recommended weather conditions when using these in any herbicide products. Broad spectrum herbicides like glyphosate or imazapyr kill any plant with which it comes into contact. So be careful when using foliar applications of broad spectrum herbicides, and spot spray just the target to prevent overspray and damage to the native plants the pollinators need. Select grass-specific or broadleaf-specific herbicides if these are appropriate for the job. Use the correct herbicide for the target species. Sloppy application techniques can result in the loss of habitat, along with spraying on a windy day, applicator inattention, or inadequate plant identification skills. So remember, though, that sometimes accidents happen and you're out there spraying, you get on a roll, and whoops, you have sprayed something desirable. So when you do this, reset, forgive yourself, ask the universe for forgiveness, and stay focused. And remember, the goal is to protect pollinators while protecting and restoring their habitat. And you are doing your best to make that happen. So take it from someone who's been there and done that more times than I care to admit. So now we've talked about some of the possible impacts of herbicides, and we're going to review some strategies to protect pollinators. And I need to, how I'm doing on time. Okay. So there are a lot of unknowns around invasive plants, pollinators, and herbicides. And the sheer lack of information is frustrating. And we do not have all the answers we would like to have. And I can personally tell you that preparing and researching and developing this program, I was frustrated by the lack of information and trying to wade through what was there. It seems very complicated, and there's again a lot we don't know. So what steps can you take to protect pollinators while controlling invasive plants that are harmful to them and our ecosystem? So first, employ integrated vegetation management principles. Second, understand and read that herbicide label. 3, time your application properly, your timing of herbicide applications. You also want to target your herbicide applications rather than broadcast spray if you can. Understand bee life cycle and bee nesting habits, native bees. And lastly, support native bees and lepidopterans. So first, let's take a look at integrated vegetation management and what that means exactly. So this graphic from the Xerces Society is a helpful way to frame developing your strategy for controlling invasive plants. Prioritize prevention and early detection of new invasive plants. Work from the areas of least infestation to the areas of greater infestation. Reserve herbicides for last and minimize their use. So what is integrated vegetation management, or IVM? So this is an approach to vegetation management that's often employed to manage vegetation along right-of-ways. So think roads and electric transmission lines, pipelines. This is related to integrated pest management. But the principles of IVM can be used by anyone as a guide in planning invasive plant management. The IVM framework is designed to be cost-effective while reducing environmental risk by combining a number of strategies to manage vegetation. Using a combination of control methods reduces the need and amount of herbicide applied to control the invasive plants. So I like to point you to this resource by Penn State Extension. They take the IVM concept a step further in their article entitled Integrated Forest Vegetation Management. And they offer these 5 steps in developing an IVM plan. So first, scout, properly identify, and map locations of invasive plants. Know what you have and where it is to begin to prioritize work and make a plan. Second, learn the life cycles of the invasive plants, including their reproductive strategies and how they spread. Make sure to implement the control measures at the correct times. 3, define your threshold levels of abundance based on management goals, priorities, and abilities. Monitor for new invasive plants and expanding infestations. 4, begin your control and use as many IVM practices as possible in concert with each other. First, start with mechanical, biological, and then chemical. Again, chemical is your last resort. And then lastly, it's always important to evaluate your results and adjust your plan. Modify the control method as needed. And if you have been to a Blue Ridge PRISM invasive plant workshop, we emphasize these strategies. All are designed to minimize the amount of herbicide released into the environment. So if you do find that you need to utilize herbicides as part of your invasive plant management strategy, use them thoughtfully and use the following best management practices to mitigate the risk of affecting native pollinators. So select the right method for the right plant with the right herbicide at the right time to reduce the exposure of pollinators to herbicides. In this example, our PRISM volunteer, Tim, selected a spot spray foliar application to control Japanese stilt grass using sethoxidem, working carefully around some native ferns. He is making the application at the right time, which is prior to the grass flowering and when the plant is actively growing. And he's applying on a cooler day to avoid volatilization. So right method, right plant, right herbicide, right time. But before you apply any herbicide, we emphasize this over and over and over. Read the entire label, and you can pay particular attention to the following headings. Environmental hazards and restrictions, a protection of pollinator statement, directions for use, application instructions, drift management. Does this product volatilize? What adjuvant should be used? What surfactants, basil oil, dye, crop oil? What do you have to use with that herbicide for it to be effective? And the application rates. What is the maximum application amount per year? And what concentration should you use on the target plant? Another resource for information about an herbicide is the product safety data sheet, which is also known as the SDS sheet. This document typically has toxicological information and ecological information, which is sometimes informative and sometimes not, but it's another resource. On this slide, we have excerpts from the safety data sheet of Alligator 90 and non-ionic surfactant, and Alligator triclopyr 4, which is triclopyr ester. The SDS for Alligator 90 on the left has no ecological information available. The SDS sheet for the triclopyr 4 has some ecological information and toxicity information. And here you can see in the terrestrial toxicity list, it says honeybee, contact, and oral LD50. So these are things that you can look for, and there are more resources for you. So I realize and have heard over and over again that herbicide labels on the products are notoriously difficult to read because of their small font. I know, I hear it from everyone. So you can check for the labels online at the manufacturer or retailer's website, or search the CDMS datasheet to download and print a copy of the label and SDS. Sometimes there's a lot of information that might be overwhelming on the labels and the SDS. And if you don't understand, ask your local extension service, contact Blue Ridge PRISM, talk to your Department of Forestry forester or another qualified professional that you trust. Do your research, and you can also contact the seller or manufacturer for help. So, you are using herbicide. Another way to mitigate and help protect pollinators is to really target your herbicide applications. Use a combination of manual and chemical control techniques when possible to reduce the need for foliar applications. Cut, stump, hack, and squirt, basil bark are extremely targeted applications, reducing the potential for herbicide overspray to native plants and the amount of herbicide used overall. These techniques are very effective during the winter months when native pollinators are not active, avoiding direct impacts and reducing the indirect impacts. If foliar application is required, spot treat individual plants or groups of plants rather than a broadcast application, and do so when the plant is not in flower. An example is controlling a small group of autumn olive. So you'll start by cutting the stems and applying herbicide directly to the cut stump. Then control any resprouts with a follow-up foliar spot spray using a broadleaf specific herbicide. Then you can monitor and hand pull seedlings. Timing herbicide applications are extremely important when protecting our native pollinators. So keep in mind that most timing recommendations are based on the times that honeybees are active because the herbicides are tested on that species. Native bees tend to be the most active earlier in the day. One of the most important mitigation strategies you can employ is to avoid a foliar herbicide when the invasive plant is in flower. Generalist bees and other pollinators do take advantage of the invasive plant's floral resources. I'm sure you've observed bumblebees feasting on porcelainberry, knotweed, autumn olive. So avoiding herbicide applications during flowering will absolutely reduce the potential for direct impacts to native pollinators. And there are other aspects to properly timing the application of herbicides to reduce impacts to pollinators. First, mind the weather. Read the label, apply the herbicide during the correct temperature and wind conditions to prevent volatilization and herbicide drift. This protects both pollinators and nearby plants. Also pay attention to the forecast for precipitation and make sure to make the application allowing enough time for the product to become rain fast and not wash off the leaves and ultimately off the site. Different herbicides have different weather requirements. So again, read that label. Some herbicides are rain fast in an hour and some take several hours. So second, thinking back to the integrated vegetation management guidelines, take the time to learn about the life cycle of the invasive plants, including the reproductive strategy and how they spread. Understanding the plant phenology and the times in the plant's life cycle for most effective control helps both you by minimizing the amount of labor and time and cost, and it helps the pollinators by minimizing the amount of herbicide. Consider, is the plant a perennial? Is it an annual? Is it a biannual? When does the plant flower? Is the plant an evergreen? So knowing when you can weed whip Japanese stilt grass, for example, just prior to flowering to effectively control it with no herbicide, or knowing that it is necessary to wait to control many vines, shrubs, and trees until after the spring leaf out, or knowing that garlic mustard rosettes can be foliar sprayed on optimal days during the winter. Take the time to learn about the target plant. And third, again, consider doing much of the work as possible during the dormant season. Most vines, shrubs, and trees are good candidates for work. And using targeted control techniques like hack and squirt. In the late winter, targets like garlic mustard and evergreen invasive shrubs and vines are good candidates for foliar control using glyphosate or triclopyr. So that was a lot of information. And please, we'll try to answer your questions. But now I'm going to turn this over to Celia, and she is going to take over and wrap up this presentation for us. Celia?
Great, thanks, Beth, and a lot of really good information. And just to kind of recap our message here, it's all about the right plant, right method, right herbicide, and right time. But I like to shift direction a little bit and just bring home the importance of providing habitat to support our native pollinators. Supporting pollinators by providing habitat is the single most important thing you can do to help. Native plants are the backbone of healthy ecosystems, and controlling invasive plants is a part of the work that we all do to ensure that our landscapes are vibrant and diverse. Consider planting native plants wherever feasible, including your home garden, landscape, hedgerows, fields, etc. And I'd like to put a plug in for our state Plant Virginia Natives Initiative, which houses 9 regional native plant campaigns, which actually comprise a large percentage of the Commonwealth. So each campaign has put together a comprehensive native plant guide that's designed for homeowners. And so you can visit the website listed here on the slide to find your regional native plant campaign and get started. Of course, it goes without saying that you should stay away from planting invasive plants, but sometimes it's hard to know what is invasive or not at the big box stores, since many invasive plants are in the nursery industry, unfortunately. This is why it's best to go native and support your local native plant nursery. I'm a big advocate for practicing what I like to call benign neglect, which means leaving some wild areas on your property, but control the invasives, of course. Leave the leaves and save the snags. And these are overwintering and nesting sites for many pollinators, and try to keep soil disturbance at a minimum in these areas, since used widely as nesting sites. Additionally, try to leave your dead flower stems up for as long as possible. So I'd like to close out this presentation with a case study that kind of wraps everything together in a sort of a real world scenario. This is featuring a project that my friends at the Clifton Institute, which is an environmental research and education center located in Fauquier County, Virginia, is stewarding. I was contacted by Marie Norwood, who's Clifton's Land Management and Outreach Associate, and she had some questions about the effects of herbicides on a population of ground nesting bees. So Clifton is advising a private landowner on a native meadow restoration project. So the restoration site is actually an old pasture that's dominated by non-native cool season pasture grasses, which is pretty typical for these kinds of sites. And part of the restoration process for a native meadow is to first eradicate the non-native pasture grasses with herbicide before seeding it in with a new native seed mix. The landowner had noticed a large aggregation of ground nesting bees in the field this spring, which was set to be converted, and was concerned because the herbicide would need to be broadcasted in this area using the foliar application method, which is pretty standard for these kinds of projects. So this is the process that I followed in order to determine what the best course of action was for this restoration project. We first needed to know what kind of bees we were dealing with. So upon further examination, and I also got a second opinion from a fellow bee researcher, we decided that these bees were likely an Andrena species, which are predominantly an early spring bee. We came to this determination based on the time of year of the nesting activity and the fact that it was an aggregation or grouping of nest holes, which is very common for this genus. And of course, the location of the nesting site in an open field, which is also very common for them. Next, I thought I would kind of think through and read up on their life cycle. And spring mining bees are typically active in our area until early May and can nest in these sort of groupings or aggregations and then come back to the same spot every year. Then I thought about how we might be able to change the restoration procedure to help these bees out. Fortunately, there isn't any other way to kill fescue grass with herbicides without using the foliar application method, so we weren't able to change that. Glyphosate is the most cost-effective and efficient herbicide for most landowners to use when eradicating fescue, and some other herbicide options could actually be more detrimental to bees, which Beth covered. So we kept that chemical option on the table. What we could do is change the time of year that the herbicide was applied so that it wouldn't affect the mining bees. So I advised Clifton that if they waited to apply the herbicide to the field either in the late May or even in the fall, the colony would be dormant at that time, and then the herbicide exposure risk would be low. So now I realize that not everyone is a native bee expert, but there are two ways to approach a situation like this. You can either reach out to your local private lands biologist like myself, and there are 6 of us in Virginia, or another conservation organization that operates in your area to just kind of seek advice on how to address this kind of a situation. Or you can do some reading yourself. And I believe that we're going to be following up with this presentation and share some resources for bee identification and life histories in a follow-up email. So we hope to leave you with a couple of big takeaways. I know there's been a lot of really great information today. Number one is that native bees are wildly understudied, and there is not a lot of research to go on, which leaves us with a lot of questions. I think you've heard us say that about 5 times today. And we do know that allowing invasive plants to outcompete native plants is a much larger issue than the possibility of causing some mortality from herbicide applications. We are not discouraging herbicide use. It is okay to continue using herbicides to manage invasive plants, just do so thoughtfully and follow best management practices. Understand the herbicide that you are using and its possible effects. Minimize herbicide use by choosing the right control method and appropriate herbicide for the job. Check the timing of your application. We know you want to do the right thing by managing the land to support our native pollinators, and we hope this presentation empowers you to do so and gives helpful guidelines to protect pollinators while also managing invasive species. According to the Xerces Society, more pesticides are used per acre in urban areas than agricultural areas for cosmetic reasons. Skip herbicides and pesticides and fertilizers too, if they're just being used to make things look pretty, and reserve them for times when you need to protect and restore pollinator habitat by managing invasives. Native plants and bees are more beneficial and much better for all of us than the appearance of a tidy yard. Okay, and with that, I
All
think
right.
we can start taking some questions, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I just want to say that apparently there's this whole thing on the internet about cute bumblebee butts. So
Yes, there is.
yeah, I mean this little butt just makes me go insane. It's so cute.
Awesome.
So, all right. Well, thank you, Celia, for wrapping this up. And I will stop sharing this presentation and then we can begin to take some questions. Thank you. Okay. Rowena, are you still on here?
Still here, and
Hi.
William, hi, great presentation, ladies. Thank you. I learned so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
William, Jim, Rod, and Tim, do you want to show your faces and help us out with our question and answers?
Yeah, I see a lot of
Yeah.
questions that
Want to
came
choose
up.
do you want to choose a question, Beth, and see let's get us
Yeah.
started.
Okay. All right. I'm just looking here.
We did our best to leave you the hard ones.
Oh, well,
There
thank you.
go. Right.
So we had some questions about pre-emergent herbicides. I think we could kind of cover some of those. And let's see. Can you cover if pre-emergents are harmful to native insects and pollinators? That is one thing that in this presentation, I actually didn't come across. I just didn't really include it because pre-emergents aren't typically what we recommend for invasive plant management. I know some people like to use pre-emergents for Japanese stilt grass, for example. Pre-emergents are typically, they're applied to the ground. So you certainly have a risk of contaminating nesting sites and cavities. So it's my understanding that pre-emergents are not the best herbicide for Japanese stilt grass. And you're also applying it during the dormant season typically. And that can impact the germination of the native plants that might be trying to come up in the Japanese stilt grass. So you also might have an indirect impact by eliminating native desirable plants. Celia, do you have any thoughts on that?
The first thing I thought of was the timing of application and when I've seen pre-emergence used. So siltgrass is definitely one of them. I have some landowners I'm working with that are using it to also control the Arthraxin, the non-native joint head grass as well. And I know with Arthraxin, they're applying it usually in February and March for, a lot of native bee activity. So that's a bonus. However, because like you mentioned, it's being applied on the ground, that could be problematic. It also lingers, when you're thinking about the life cycle, the life terms of herbicide, and you had that great slide about how long they kind of persist for, and that is one that's going to persist. So I imagine it's probably a mixed bag, and I did not come across anything particular in terms of readings about research with bees and pre-emergent herbicides, so I can't really say for sure what the effects are.
I think I would approach it like using all herbicides with caution, understanding the label, and the be conservative, be knowledgeable. Just use all of the guidelines that we presented here if you're considering pre-emergent. And there's another question related to pre-emergence. Yeah.
Let me just jump in on that, on pre-emergence
Yeah, go
too,
ahead.
just a couple more points. I would reiterate everything but that both you and Celia said about them and caution on them. And I would refer folks also to Penn State. I don't have a website for you, but they've done extensive research on on herbicides, pre-emergence in particular, in relation to stilt grass also. And I've heard the same as well about about pre-emergent effectiveness on stilt grass. The biologists in Shenandoah National Park have been disappointed in its effectiveness. However, they also use pre-emergence on plants like perilla, and we'll do an application of an herbicide called pendulum. Pendimethalin is the operative chemical on that. In late February, March or so time frame, and pendulum has a residual, and it's intended to have a residual effectiveness or residence in the soil for up to 3 months or so, between 2 and 3 months, depending on how much you apply. I have found pendulum to be critical for the control of the smartweed species, long bristled smartweed, and spotted lady's thumb too, which I just simply have not been able to control using standard herbicides, triclopyr or glyphosate during the growing season. Critical to prevent its impact on the germination of native plants, which are often growing in the same situation as Persicaria, or the smartweeds would be, is to spray it early enough so that its soil activity doesn't persist into the germination time frame of native plants that'll be germinating in, let's say, late April, early May.
I was just going to mention that, depending on which pre-emergent you use, you could be affecting any native seeds that are in the soil bank from germinating, which is really counterproductive if you want the natives and trying to get rid of the invasives.
Yeah, William, that was my last point regarding control of the Persicaria species and doing the application early enough so that it doesn't affect the germination of later germinating native plants.
Yeah, all good points. Thank you, Jim. All right, we'll try to take a few more questions. We'll spill over a few minutes, and if you have to hop off right at one, just remember this is being recorded. You can catch up, and we'll also send out copies of the questions and answers, and also some resources for all of those who registered for this meeting. Celia, this might be a good question for you. Do you have a list of when native bees are most susceptible in the Fauquier County area, and which pesticides we should use at what time? Do those kinds of lists exist?
No.
Okay.
Definitely not something that's specific either. I mean, I don't even know if they're like a regional or national list. I don't think we have the research or information to kind of create something like that. We have researchers from UVA and other entities that are doing just kind of native bee inventories and things like that. So we know species that are in the area, but it's not really in any sort of translatable way that we can put into like a Word document. It's on databases. And then certainly, juxtaposing that with herbicides, I mean, that's a big unknown, as you mentioned in the presentation. I mean, honeybees are the species that's tested, and it's expected that is supposed to translate to native bees, whatever the research finds with them, and that's just not the case. So it would be nice to have something like that one day, but I think we're pretty far off from being able to produce something like that.
Yeah. All right, very good question. And so I also have another question for you from Michael, and they're asking about, do adult bees consume and eat the pollen, or is it used only to provision their eggs with nutrition?
Very good question. I love
specific
questions.
Good job, Michael.
Yeah. So adult bees will consume pollen. It just sort of depends on the species. This is like the answer for every pollinator question. It depends on the species. It depends on the life cycle. It depends if it's a male or a female. They've got different nutritional needs throughout their life cycle as well. And, like, for instance, right now, because I'm a bumblebee nerd. The bumblebee queens are coming out from hibernation, and they're predominantly just like fueling up on nectar. And then after that, they're going to start collecting pollen and start making nests and things like that. But it kind of changes depending, essentially. But
Okay, thank you. Let's see what other questions we have popping up. Let's see.
Beth, it looks like Rod is ready to answer the question, what are the long-term effects on soil chemistry when soil is exposed to herbicides?
Yes.
Sure,
What are
sure.
the long-term effects? Yeah.
I'll chime in on that one. I actually pressed the wrong button, but in any case,
Okay.
what I was going to mention, it doesn't necessarily answer the complete question, but I just wanted to point out that most of the herbicides that we talk about, be it Roundup or Triclopyr, tend to have half-lives in the 30 to 50 day range, which means they break down when they come in contact with the soil. And so over a period of time, the herbicides at least become neutralized. They tend not to flow through the ground. They don't translocate much through the soil. So from that standpoint, there's not a lot of impact over a long period of time. But whether there's other changes to the soil chemistry, that I do not know the answers to.
Mm-hmm. And I can't say that there is a lot of research around that topic. I'm not certain. We also had a question that had come in, a pre-submitted question about herbicide impacting the mycorrhizae in the soil and those important relationships between plants and the fungi and all of those interactions. And I don't know if we really quite know quite understand the full impacts of some of these chemicals.
Yeah.
So, yeah, more
Yeah,
research. We need more research.
It's a
right.
great question. I mean, and we do need more
Yeah.
research because it's
Yeah.
not known, I don't think.
Yeah. Okay, and I think we'll try to cover one more question. Let's see.
Here's a really quick one before the last one.
Thank you.
Is there a,
go ahead.
probably for Celia, as someone, Elizabeth asked if there's a reference site available where we can see the different types of ground nesting holes for bees. I would love to know that too, so you would know which type.
Yeah.
Yes,
More
and
complicated than that, but
yeah, I'm thinking about that a little bit because so there's we're going to be sharing, I think, in the follow-up resources list, a link to the Discover a Life page. So that's got a number of, well, any species on the planet really, but there's a number of different native bee guides within there. So that's, to kind of help folks if they're interested in reading about understanding how to identify bees and things like that. They might have something in that, like that in there. Problem is a lot of this information is kind of scattered, and there are a lot of bee researchers, certainly led by Sam Droby, who's with USGS up at the Patuxent, Maryland Wildlife Refuge, who's really trying to bring a lot of this information together in online databases. So it might take some poking around, but I think the Discover Life web page might be the best place to start, and then go from there.
I just put that link in the chat.
yeah.
And then the Virginia Working Landscapes has a nice little pamphlet on bumblebees of Virginia. And I just dropped that in the chat too. So I think at this point, we will go ahead and wrap up our webinar for today. Rowena, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to all of you speakers and panelists for helping us answer the questions, and to our wonderful audience for being here with us today. Just a reminder that there is an exit survey that's really short, and we really appreciate if you just take a moment to fill that out so we can just do a better job for next time and meet the needs that you have for our next workshop. Other than that, just remember that because you registered, you'll get a link to the recording of this presentation, and we'll also send out a list of resources and just extra information for you, just as such like the thing that Celia talked about, just the different links to the website. So you don't have to try to memorize everything at once. We will be sending you that later in an email. But other than that, thank you so much, everyone. And we hope to see you at our next workshop.
Yes, and thank you,
Bye.
everyone, and thank you, Celia.
Thanks,
Bye,
Beth.
everyone.
Bye.
We'll let people roll off here. If you want to hang on for a minute. I think Celia jumped off already.
Yeah, sure.